All right. Good evening. Uh, Welcome to Channeling Jewish History Podcast. I'm honored to be here with Professor Shaul Magid, who is the author of a new book on Meir Kahane. It's called Meir Kahane, The Public Life and Political Thought of an American Jewish Radical, just out by Princeton University Press. So first of all, I want to thank you, Professor Magid, for joining me. And tell me a little bit about this book for people, for the uninitiated.
Well, Meir Kahane was a pretty well-known figure, certainly within the Jewish world in the U.S. and Israel. Um, he kind of enters into the public sphere in 1968, where he founds the Jewish Defense League in response to some of the anti-Semitism that resulted from the 1968 Ocean Hill-Brownsville Brooklyn school strike, which is a tremendous school strike that really brought the entire New York City school system to a halt. And there's a long story about that. But before that, he was a sports writer for a while. He wrote for the Jewish press. He was a rabbi. He was a youth leader. He was kind of, you know, basically on his way to a kind of middling career as a modern Orthodox rabbi in the United States. But he really had aspirations for something more, and he decides to enter into the kind of the heyday of the counterculture, the race wars, the culture wars, with a particular ideology of Jewish. I don't know if I would call it Jewish chauvinism, but certainly Jewish pride that was happening in other parts of the United States. Black Panthers, Black nationalism, and the militant anti-Vietnam War movement, the SDS, and the Weather Underground. So that's how he kind of enters, and then very quickly by the end of '69 gets involved in the Soviet Jewry movement, which we can talk about, and then in 1971 immigrates to Israel. So in a certain sense, the real heyday of Kahana is between around 67, 68, and 72, 73, because he keeps coming back and forth to America the first couple of years he's living in Israel. But once he lives in Israel, he begins to kind of build a political movement there, and we can talk more about that.
Yeah, you make an interesting point, which I don't know if a lot of people picked up, but that Rabbi Kahana is usually looked at as an Israeli phenomenon, very much less so as an American phenomenon. Whereas you claim that, for his entire life, he basically lived in America. And even when he lived in Israel, lived in his kind of own American bubble, so to speak.
Yeah,
But at the same time, he did succeed. You claim that he ultimately, I mean, you don't claim this. The fact is that he did ultimately fail in his stated goals. But it's kind of ironic because on the one hand, he also, I mean, I'm jumping far ahead, that a lot of his ideas became mainstream. So he did sort of succeed in that sense. And he also succeeded in kind of creating this really loyal following in Israel, maybe less so in America, but in Israel, I mean, his name was all over the place, and there is that undercurrent of Khanism that you'll find in large swathes of the population. So how do you explain that? On the one hand, he failed, but on the one hand, he actually did kind of succeed.
yeah. I mean, it's really good to see the two parts of his life as both separate and intertwined, the United States and Israel. I think the thesis of my book is that we really underestimate the impact that he had in America in the short time that he was there, in terms of developing develop a kind of ethos of Jewish pride and Jewish survivalism, and in a certain sense, when he gets to Israel, he's a failure for a number of reasons. But one of the main reasons I think he's a failure in Israel politically is that he never really was able to think outside of the American categories that he kind of came to know in the 1960s and early 1970s. The way he looked at race, the way he looked at anti-Semitism, survival in a minority culture versus being the majority culture. There's some way in which he never was really able to translate into a new kind of cultural paradigm. Um, but in America at the time, he was extremely popular, and not only popular, but and this is the kind of speculative part of the book in some way. I argue that he really kind of sunk roots pretty deep into the American collective self-conscious, or subconscious, I should say, and that many things that he was talking about in the 1960s and early 1970s have actually become quite mainstream today. And I think if you separate Kahana's worldview from his tactics, and his tactics were actually militancy, violence, all that stuff. But in that sense, he was really a product of his time. I mean, that was what was happening in the late 1960s and early 1970s. That the worldview separate from the militancy actually still, I think, resonates very strongly in certain sectors of American Jewry. In Israel, it's also true, but I think, and we can talk about this too, I think that people that are either call themselves Kahanis or are called Kahanis by others in Israel, I prefer to use the term neo-Kahanist. I think that they're not really Kahanists. They're a certain amalgam of the national religious educational system of Cookian, mystical, messianic ideology and Kahana's kind of militant tactics. Kahala was never really interested in Rev Kook. He never mentions him or rarely mentions him. There's one photograph of him with Zvi de Kook when he came to visit his son in yeshiva, but Kahana was into power and conquest. He didn't have a romantic bone in his body. So I think that's a difference.
It's interesting. I mean, there's definitely a lot more to look into in terms of his attitude towards religious Zionism and towards Rav Kook. It's important to point out, as you do in the book, that at the end of the day, he did send his children to study at the Rav Kook Yeshiva, Merkaz Rav. His children all grew up, were raised in that kind of religious Zionist environment, married into prominent religious Zionist families. Yet at the same time, you're 100% right that, I mean, I remember Ehud Sprinzak in, I think, Brother Against Brother, actually juxtaposes passages from Rav Kook's Orot and kind of contrasts them with passages from Ora Rayon from Kahana's Magnum Opus to show some important differences. I always thought that was pretty enlightening. Right. And there are absolutely important differences between the two, as you point out. But at the same time, he kind of, I would say, and you also actually put this book in the bibliography. I really like that. Mark Shapiro's book on Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg called Between the Yeshiva World and Modern Orthodoxy. Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg is a fascinating individual in his own right. And he lived kind of on the edge, halfway in the Yeshiva Haredi world and sort of halfway in the modern Orthodox. That's pre-World War II, modern Orthodox German, Torah Derech Eretz, modern Orthodoxy, while Kahane was sort of already in Brooklyn, kind of enmeshed in the modern Orthodox community, the YU community, the religious Zionist community. Yet at the same time, he chose not to attend YU. He actually preferred the Meir Yeshiva, and we'll get to that soon also, and what kind of influence that had on his life. But you're right, we do see sort of this amalgamation, but then yet the tension, it's sort of like very confusing to this day to kind of place him in any category, as you already point out, in terms of the right-left paradigm doesn't work with him either. He doesn't work neatly in any category.
Yeah,
that's very, very interesting. You have anything you want to say about that?
I think one of the interesting differences between Kook and Kahane, and there are many, but one of the interesting ones is that the Cookian school, and by Cookian school I'm referring both to Avram Yitzhak and Zvi Yehuda, because in a certain sense that's what the religious Zionist movement becomes. The Cookian school ultimately is willing to not only tolerate but also give value to secular Zionism and the secular state. I mean, obviously, Reb Tzvi Yehuda Kook, of course, makes this whole notion of that, serving in the army itself as a mitzvah because the state itself is holy. It's not just the land that's holy. I mean, he makes the move that his father doesn't make. But for Kahane, the secular Zionism had no value whatsoever. He was an anti-secular Zionist. He didn't think that he thought that the secular state was a reproduction of a kind of American liberalism that he thought was ultimately a failure. So in a sense, he doesn't hold that dialectic between secularism and kedusha that's really kind of at the very spine of the Cookian worldview. And so when the Knesset rejects him in the racism law, he basically says to the secular Zionists, and by the way, not only on the left, I mean, Yossi Sarid and Geula Cohen, people on the right and on the left, that the only real racism is secular Zionism. He doesn't consider himself a racist because he believes that God gave the land of Israel to the Jews. And he's saying, if you don't believe that, then what right did the Jews have to the land? In a certain sense, he basically says the only thing is a certain kind of racialization. Now, it's interesting the way he does that, but I think that this shows you that the Cookian view of things and the Kahana's view of things are really very different. And there is, as you say, that amalgam where it's become Cookian ideology with Kahana's tactics. Because Tzvi Yehuda
Right,
was very
right.
against violence, and Tzvi Yehuda spoke very strongly
Yeah,
against acts of violence against the Arab population. Kahana didn't.
right. Yet we, there were it was the Jewish underground, which was not a Kahanas phenomenon that came out of Gush Emunim, and there were, you know, there was militancy on the part of that community as well, outside of Kahana influenced people.
Right. I mean, if I could just say
Was
something,
expansion? Yeah,
no, I
yeah,
think it's important to note from my perspective that especially especially after the election of Begin and when settler enterprise becomes part of Israeli policy, as long as the settlers are expanding and able to kind of accomplish what they want to accomplish, there's no need for kahana and there's no need for violence. It's only when the state starts to resist the project that you see after the Hitnatkut, after the Gaza wars, after Oslo, suddenly when history seems to be going in the other direction, Kahana's militancy is just kind of waiting in the wings.
right, right. Now let's backtrack a little bit to his early days in Brooklyn, and he kind of comes to the fore during that famous Ocean Hill Brownsville teacher strike, as you mentioned, where the JDL kind of comes into its own, and there it's this is not a Jew versus Arab thing. It's more of a Jew versus other minorities, blacks and Hispanics chiefly, as you mentioned, and Khan is obviously very active in defending the Jews against what he perceived as minority anti-Semitism from mostly black militants. And you posit in the book that there's a racist motive there. In other words, you believe that he was a racist. Now, I understand racism as a very simple definition of someone considering someone else permanently blighted due to his ethnicity and race, skin color, something along those lines. I don't see, where do you see that in Kahana's writings or sayings? You do mention that he uses the language of race. Does that make a racist? I mean, perhaps that is a definition of racist.
That's a good question, and I'm very reluctant to use the term to use the term racist because I don't really think it's a very useful analytical category. Um, Whether he was a racist or not, really, I mean, I can't say because I didn't know him, and I can't say because I'm not him. So I'm not sure exactly what he thought about those, and also how you categorize racism. It's also, I mean, from a certain perspective, we're all racist in that way. We're all in some way we're taking advantage of white privilege all the time. But what was more interesting to me was the way he used what critical race theorists call the grammar of racism. In other words, he used race. He used definitions of race. He used racial categories. He used racial language in order to be able to promote a particular point of view. And that point of view is basically that, the African Americans are anti Semitic. We don't owe them anything because this was a time where reparations was a very big thing, right? Um, in a certain way, he was what's more interesting to me is the way as you say, the way he used it, what I call the grammar of racism. Whether calling him a racist or not a racist, he certainly was trafficking in racist paradigms in
Right.
what he said and how he acted and things that he said in public and things that the JDL did.
Yet at the same time, there was a lot of respect for him, although a lot, maybe perhaps it wasn't shown. It was kind of like, let's stay in America before we even go to Israel. I mean, I'm sure you're aware that, I'll start from the end. At his funeral, some pretty prominent, figures in secular Jewish American establishment actually showed up to pay their respects, like Abe Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League had some nice things to say about his activism for the Jews of the Soviet Union. I can't recall, but there were some big names. came to pay their respects. And during his long career, people as varied as Bob Dylan admired him and had good things to say about him during his activist days. And that brings me to another point. There was a certain curvy kind of aspect to him that I also don't think is appreciated enough. I've seen that in several different sources and also from people who have spoken at his events. I've seen recordings of Baalei Tshuva who consider him just a Baal Tshuva, a Rebbe, or a Rav who was involved in making Baalei Tshuva on American college campuses. Also at a time when that maybe wasn't such a popular thing to do, other than perhaps Chabad. I don't even know if Aish was around at that point. So that's another thing. I mean, he did have that charisma, I guess, and a message that resonated with a lot of secular Jewish kids. Not all of them stuck with him, obviously, but quite a few did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in an Esquire magazine feature article that he did that was entitled Super Jew back in I think 71, he actually talks about this and he says that he doesn't consider the JDL a Kirov movement, meaning that he doesn't, his interest is not bringing people back to orthodoxy. If that's where they want to go, then that's fine. What he's interested in doing is making Jews proud to be Jews. So I mean, I think that you're right in terms of Kirov, but it's not Kirov to practical religion per se. It's Kirov to one's Jewishness, right? He was
Right.
interested in
Right.
identity building.
Right.
And I think in a certain way, a lot of secular Jews, especially those that were radicalized by the New Left in the 60s, who got disillusioned after the New Left turned anti Israel after the 67 war, a lot of those Jews saw Kahane as a, a particular Jewish iteration of radicalism. In other words, it was taking that radical leftist politics, which was a critique of liberalism, and then just moving it into a kind of reactionary Kahanist politics, which was also a critique of liberalism from the other side. So now it wasn't about going to the streets to fight against the war in Vietnam or to fight against communism. It was, or not against communism, but to fight against imperialism. It was basically to go out in the street and fight against Jewish causes. And Soviet Jewry was the great cause celeb of the whole thing. It brought, the Soviet Jewry brought the Jewish right and left together.
True. True. Definitely.
So
Definitely
I
united.
think that in my view, I don't see Kahane as a religious thinker in America. I mean, if you look at the books that he wrote in America, certainly Never Again, that's really the only good, Never Again in his book on Vietnam. There's very little religion. He finds religion later in Israel because he realized that's his base. I mean, it's the national religious yeshivot and the Mizrahim that are going to be his base.
Right. And it's interesting that the Mizrahim are mostly secular, very traditional. I respect religion, but many would not consider them to be white. In fact, they consider themselves the underclass, and the Israeli Black Panthers. And you mentioned how there was tension between the Israeli Black Panthers and the Kach movement.
Right.
But he definitely, because it's, I mean, for many, a part of the reason, maybe most of the reason, is because he was poaching from he was basically taking away their people, so to speak. He was definitely a competitor.
Right.
He was basically taken from the same population, and although that was very much on the radical left, also very confusing because not all Black Panthers were pro-Arab actually, and some of them actually became pretty prominent in more nationalist secular circles and like Likud type of parties of the Likud itself. But I want to go back a little bit to while he was still in America, and ask you about his involvement, during the campaign for Soviet Jewry. I read an interesting biography of Rabbi Herschel Schachter, written by Professor Medoff, where he mentions Kahane there several times. Herschel Schachter was very involved in the movement at the time, and even though he was also head of the Religious Zionists of America and he was a very prominent rabbi, many rabbis looked askance, to say the least, at his militant activities for Soviet Jewry, including the Rebbe Lubavitch, for instance, Most, I would say, thought they were against it because they thought that the ends were not going to, the means were not going to get them to the ends that he was looking for. In other words, violence was only going to make things worse. Um, Not so much that violence is an un-Jewish thing. Am I on the right track about that?
Yeah, I mean, Kahane certainly tried to undermine the whole notion that Judaism is a nonviolent religion, and nonviolence is really a kind of essential
Right.
value. I mean, he would, he'd basically say, no society is nonviolent. I mean, it just doesn't exist. I mean, violence is just a part of human civilization. I think on the Soviet Jewry thing, it really was an interesting breach because from the beginning, from Yaakov Birnbaum in 1964, when the Soviet Jewry movement is founded, and this is when people like Hershel Schachter were involved, and Avi Weiss was also involved, and a lot of others. It really, a lot of students from YU. It really was very committed to it was very committed to diplomacy as the path towards trying to alleviate the problem. And Kahana, I think, came in 1969 and basically said, that's just not going to work. That you're not going to basically get the Soviet Union to agree to anything. The only way to move the Soviet movement forward is to get it on the front page of the New York Times. And the only way to get it on the front page of the New York Times is through act of civil disobedience. So that's kind of what he in a certain sense took the movement over to say, you want to get on the front of the New York Times, chain yourself to the fence of the embassy, get arrested, you'll be on the front page of the Times, there'll be a story about Soviet Jewry, and you'll raise the consciousness of a country that wasn't really very much aware of what was going on with Soviet Jews on that issue. And there was a real disagreement between those people who were on his side and the other people who were basically committed to a diplomatic approach. Now, I'm not sure, again, which one was a better approach. Kahane seemed to take it over, but then he overextended himself. And he had actually undermined the movement because he somehow couldn't really control what was going on in terms of arms smuggling and all kinds of other bomb making. In other words, once you enter into that militant milieu, you can see it with the Weather Underground, you start to lose control of what's going on. So, the Sol Hurak bombing, which happened in 1971, which was when people from the JDL, although no one was ever convicted, threw a firebomb into the offices of a Jewish impresario that used to bring
Right.
Russian acts in, right? So once that happened and a woman was inadvertently killed, a Jewish woman, Iris Collins, was inadvertently killed,
Yes.
that was really kind of the end of it. It kind of, in the same way that the Weather Underground ended up destroying itself when that bomb went off in the apartment in Greenwich Village, that kind of ended it. But I
The
will
Kahane,
say,
yeah,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
yeah.
No,
No, no. I remember Kahane reading that Kahane's reaction to the Sol York bombing was, he said, I felt exactly like Menachem Begin after the King David bombing, when quite a few Jews were killed at the King David bombing as well. It wasn't
yeah.
just British soldiers.
And I think it's
Personnel.
probably true that he didn't know that it was going to happen.
Yeah.
Um, but again, it's about starting something and then losing control of it.
Right.
He also crashed the Soviet Union conference in Brussels. That was
Yes.
a big deal, and
Right.
tried to speak and was kind of kicked
Right.
out and arrested
Yes.
and sent back to New York. So and also at the same time, in the same year, had the largest Soviet Jewry one of the largest protests at the White House in the history of the country, the Soviet Jewry
Right.
March in March 1971. So it was a very kind of his relationship with Soviet Jewry was a very complicated story because it was really a different view of how to move things forward.
Yeah. I mean, he's obviously complicated in every sense, and every now and then people like to kind of recount some salacious details about his undercover life as Michael King and his affair with a young lady. And I feel like things like that. I mean, we have Martin Luther King's affairs, that I don't think is given a lot of press, for
Sure.
instance.
Yeah.
That's more suppressed.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Look, it was the same thing with true with John F. Kennedy. I mean, it's the
Right.
way. First of all, at that time, things were even more easily suppressed than they are today. I didn't really
Yeah.
spend a lot of time on that, the kind of thing. Some people have written some stuff about it that I thought was good. I mentioned it, his affair. I mean, it was kind of an interesting. There was something very interesting about it in terms of the psychology, right? So he has this affair, breaks off the relationship. The woman jumps off the pier of the East River. It's on the front page of the Daily News, and and then he sets up a foundation in her name, a charitable foundation in her name. I mean, it's kind of startling in a way for somebody that was involved in some kind of clandestine affair. Um, that he somehow still felt either guilty or attached to what happened, and it's
Humans
look
are complicated.
he what's that? Yeah, it's very very complicated, and he
Emotions. It's human emotions. You can't. Yeah.
what's that?
No, I'm saying human emotions. You can't really.
Yeah, and he
It's
was
hard to make sense of it.
when he worked with Joseph Khorba, who was a childhood friend, a Syrian Jew from Flatbush, who became a very big um, a person in Republican politics in the mid 1960s, and he and Khorba set up the Fourth of July Society. And Khorba was living in D.C. and Kahane used to go down, and Khorba would like introduce him, to the nightlife. There's a whole seedy underside of that whole world, those kind of halls of power. And in the mid 60s he became aware of that, and I think connected to it, which I think brought him to, in 1968 he testified before Congress on Soviet Jewry. You could think of, like, how did they come to Meir Kahane? I mean, who was Meir Kahane to testify before Congress? Right, it was because he had a connection with Khorba, and he had a connection with the kind of political establishment in DC.
Yeah, Jorge's a very mysterious guy too. And there's not much known about him. You say that he destroyed all his papers. I think one of his relatives,
Yeah.
Libby Khan,
Libby
said that
Kahane
she
said
was
that
looking.
she tried to find out, and he had destroyed
Right,
everything before he died.
right. It's interesting. Why would you? What was in those papers? You think that.
We'll never know.
We'll never know, right? I mean, it could have just been one of those eccentrics that destroyed their papers. There are many intellectuals throughout history who've done that, right?
Yes, yeah,
Not really anything earth-shattering in there.
yeah.
Since we mentioned Libby Kahana, you do mention her in your book that you carefully use your words, read her biography of her late husband, her 2-volume biography. I only have volume 1. I haven't gotten to 2 yet. What did you think of the book, and what was your relationship like with her in terms of
I
what did
have
you
no
think of your?
I have no relationship with her. I know that she emailed a friend of mine and asked for a copy of my book. I've never met her. I would like to meet her. Um, I read her book very carefully. She's a professional archivist, or was. I mean, she's
Right.
retired now, but she was a professional archivist, and she does a lot of really interesting work providing primary documents, correspondence, letters between them, kind of filling in certain gaps in the story. And surprisingly, you would think that, given that they were married, that it would be kind of very hagiographic and very kind of, it wasn't. It was actually quite honest. I mean, I think that I really had a lot of respect for the fact that she did not shy away from the controversy. She actually had a particular point of view, but she offered some very interesting data points. For example, just give you one tidbit, right? That Kahane was in Beitar Youth in the 1950s, the Jabotinsky movement, and Kahane's father knew Jabotinsky. Is a long story, and but in like sometime in the 1950s, he left Beitar and joined Bnei Akiva, and it wasn't ever clear why. And she actually produces a letter where, basically he says to her, once I was a member of Beitar and I believed in the kind of revisionist militancy, but now that the state is established, we have to try to make it as, religious a state as possible. So, it's worth it to be in Bnei Akiva rather than Beitar. So it's kind of interesting, somebody in the early 50s. We're talking about somebody that's very young, that's kind of
Right.
making that move. And then you're right, he goes to YU for a bit, a semester, doesn't really stay, ends up going to the Meir. Um, it's not really
Why
clear.
is that? I'm wondering.
It had
Right.
something to do with his father. His father wanted him to go to the Meir. His father was one of the kind of financial backers when the Meir Yeshiva came to the U.S. And he was very kind of involved in establishing the yeshiva in Brooklyn. And the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva, one of the Rosh Yeshiva was Avram Kalmanovitz, who was originally in Telz, and then he was in Shanghai for a while. He was in Japan, and he was one of the leaders of the Muslim movement of that generation. And his father seemed to want him to study there and not YU. But so that's that. He spent a lot of time there. He spent 13 years there.
Right. He spent the lion's share of his, student days, yeshiva days at the Meir. You'd think that he would take on a more Haredi orientation, when he finally got smicha and became a rabbi, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The Haredism kind of comes much, much later in life,
Right.
which doesn't,